The morning Ralph Chandler stood at the edge of his dead field, and felt nothing was the morning he understood that grief had finally finished what drought had started. It was the spring of 1882 in the Cimarron Valley of the Oklahoma Territory, and the land stretched out before him like a wound that refused to close. 3 years ago, before Clara had died and the baby with her, this field had been something worth looking at. Corn in long, deliberate rows. Squash sprawling green and generous along the southern fence. A kitchen garden that Clara had tended with such precision and such love that their neighbors, the Hargrove family, had once ridden 2 miles out of their way just to see it. That was the kind of garden it had been. That was the kind of woman she had been. Now the earth was cracked and pale, ribboned through with ruts from seasons of rain and wind that had gone unmanaged, unturned, unloved. The wooden fence posts along the perimeter leaned at odd angles. The tool shed at the far end of the property had lost half its roof to a November ice storm 18 months back, and Ralph had nailed a tarpaulin over the gap and told himself he would fix it properly when the mood struck him. The mood had not struck him. He suspected it never would again. He was 31 years old, and some mornings he felt like a man twice that age. Ralph turned from the field and walked back toward the house, a 2-room structure he had built with his own hands in 1877, when the territory was still considered a gambler's proposition by most people with any sense. He had not had sense. He had had Clara, which had seemed like a better thing to have. The house still stood straight. He kept the roof mended and the water barrel full, and the horses fed because those were the minimum requirements of a living man, and Ralph Chandler was still, technically, a living man. He pulled his hat down over his eyes against the morning glare and went to see about his horses. The 2 animals, a bay gelding he called Hector and a paint mare he had never properly named and so just called the mare, were standing at the fence of the corral with their heads lifted, ears rotated forward toward the south road. Ralph followed their gaze and saw a dust cloud moving along the wagon track that cut through the valley from the town of Cutler's Creek, 4 miles distant. He watched without particular interest. People passed through sometimes. Homesteaders heading further west, which was always a mistake in Ralph's estimation. Traveling merchants. Once, a surveying crew from the railroad company that had spent 3 uncomfortable days camped on his property before he had asked them, with a politeness that barely concealed his irritation, to move along. The dust cloud resolved itself as it came closer. It was a wagon, a single-horse rig that had seen considerable use. The horse pulling it was a compact dun animal that moved with the careful, deliberate step of a creature that had been on the road for some time. Sitting in the wagon seat was a woman. Ralph put his hand on the top rail of the corral fence and watched. She drove with the reins held low and steady in both hands, the way a person drives when they have been driving a long time and have stopped thinking consciously about it. She wore a plain brown dress and a bonnet that had shifted to one side in what he assumed was the wind, though she did not seem to notice or care. Beside her on the seat was a wooden box, and stacked in the bed of the wagon were several more boxes and a canvas bag that appeared quite heavy, and several smaller cloth sacks tied shut at the neck. She turned the wagon off the south road onto the track that led to his property. Ralph straightened up from the fence. She pulled the wagon to a stop about 20 feet from where he stood and looked at him with clear, dark eyes that were the color of good river water in the shade. Her face was sun-browned and composed, the face of a woman who had been making decisions for herself for long enough that the habit had settled into her features. She was perhaps 26 or 27 years old, he thought, maybe younger. It was difficult to be precise about a face that had both weathered and maintained itself at the same time. "Ralph Chandler," she said. Her voice was even and direct, not unfriendly, just not wasting anything. "That's me," he said. "My name is Olive Talmadge," she said. "I believe you received my letter." He had received a letter. He had read it twice and then placed it under the loose floorboard in the kitchen where he kept documents of uncertain importance, alongside the land deed and a promissory note he had long since repaid, and Clara's recipe for cornbread, which he could not bring himself to use or throw away. The letter had been written in a careful, unhurried hand, and had explained in practical terms that Olive Talmadge of Abilene, Kansas, was a widow of 2 years and a capable homesteader in her own right, and that she had been corresponding with the minister in Cutler's Creek, one Reverend Fulton, who had written to her on behalf of several unattached men in the valley who might benefit from a partner of practical experience and steady disposition. The letter had not been romantic in any conventional sense. It had read more like the opening terms of a business negotiation, conducted by someone who respected both parties too much to pretend it was anything else. Ralph had read it and thought about it and not responded, and then thought about it again late one night when the silence in the house had become particularly loud, and he had written back a single short paragraph saying that she was welcome to come and see the place, and that he made no promises about anything beyond that. He had not expected her to actually come. "I received it," he said. She studied him for a moment without speaking. He was a tall man, lean in the way that hard-working men who don't eat enough become lean, with dark hair going gray at the temples before its time, and a jaw that could have used a better introduction to a razor 3 or 4 days ago. He had the look, she thought, of a man who had been through something, and had decided to keep living out of sheer stubbornness rather than any particular enthusiasm for the project. She had known men like that. She had been, if she was honest with herself, a woman like that for a while after her husband James had died of a fever on the Kansas plains, leaving her with their small homestead, and a silence so complete it had rung like a bell in her ears for months. "May I step down?" she asked. "You may," he said, and moved to take the dun horse's bridle. She climbed down from the wagon with the ease of someone accustomed to doing it without assistance, though she noted that he moved toward her instinctively, as though he had remembered something about helping women from the wagon and was a half-second behind his own memory. She thought that was worth noting. Not much, but something. She stood in his yard and looked at the house, the corral, the tool shed with its tarpaulin roof patch, and then turned and looked at the field. She stood looking at the field for a long time without speaking. "It has not been worked," she said finally. "No," he said, 3 years. He was briefly surprised that she had known this, then remembered that Reverend Fulton had likely shared everything and more. Small towns were libraries of other people's business. 3 years, he confirmed. She nodded, as though this answered a question she had already formed an opinion about. Then she walked back to the wagon and lifted the wooden box from the seat and set it on the ground at her feet and opened the lid. Inside, packed in layers with dry straw between them, were seed packets, dozens of them. Some wrapped in cloth, some in paper, some in small clay pots sealed with wax. There were more seeds in the canvas bag and the cloth sacks, he realized. She had brought enough seeds to plant a considerable operation. Ralph looked at the seeds and then looked at her. "You brought seeds," he said, and he was aware as he said it that it was not the most illuminating observation he had ever made. "I brought seeds," she agreed. "I have been saving and trading for them since last autumn. I have corn varieties suited to this soil, 2 kinds of squash, pole beans, climbing peas, broom corn, a kitchen garden selection, and some sweet potato slips I have been keeping alive in damp cloth since Abilene." She paused. "They are doing tolerably well for having traveled this far." He looked at her steadily. "Miss Talmadge," he said. "Mrs. Talmadge," she corrected, not sharply, just precisely. "Mrs. Talmadge, I wrote to you that I made no promises." "I know what you wrote," she said. "I am not here asking for promises. I am here because I have a skill and you have land, and the arrangement seemed sensible to investigate in person." She closed the lid of the wooden box. "You don't have to decide anything today. Let me see the field and I'll tell you what I think. Then you can decide." He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the wooden box because it was clearly heavy and she had already been carrying it, and carried it to the porch steps. "Come on then," he said. She followed him to the field. They walked the perimeter first without speaking. She stopped at intervals to crouch down and take a handful of soil and rub it between her palms, smell it, let it fall. She was methodical about it, patient in the way of someone who had learned patience not as a virtue but as a practical tool. He walked beside her and watched her work and said nothing because there did not seem to be anything useful to say. The field was roughly 4 acres. In its neglected state it had grown a sparse, stubborn cover of buffalo grass and some ragweed along the eastern fence, and a stand of sunflowers near the old irrigation ditch at the north end, their stalks brown and dry from the previous summer. The soil itself was the characteristic dark clay loam of the Cimarron bottomland, extraordinarily rich when properly managed, the kind of soil that could make a hardworking person look like a genius if the rain cooperated even moderately. Olive stood at the north end near the dry irrigation ditch and looked back toward the house. "This ditch," she said, "does it connect to the creek?" "The North Fork of the Cimarron runs about a quarter-mile north of here," he said. "I dug the ditch in '79. There's a sluice gate at the creek end. I used to run it 3 times a week in dry spells. Has the gate held? Last time I checked it." "When was that?" He thought about it. 18 months ago, maybe. She turned and looked at him, not with judgment exactly, but with the frank assessment of someone recalculating a set of figures. "It will need to be checked and probably repaired before we run it," she said. "The soil is good. It is tired, but it is not dead. With the right preparation it could produce well this season if we start now." She paused and looked at the sky, which was the deep, cloudless blue of early May in the territory. "We are late, but not impossibly late for corn. The beans and squash can go in through June. The kitchen garden we can start immediately." "You have given this considerable thought," he said. "I gave it considerable thought before I loaded the wagon in Abilene," she said. "I am not in the habit of traveling 4 days on uncertain roads without knowing what I am traveling toward." She looked at him again with those river water eyes. "The question is whether you want to work this field, Mr. Chandler, not whether it can be worked." It was a more direct question than he had been asked in 3 years, and it landed on him in a way that was not entirely comfortable. "I used to want to," he said, after a pause that stretched perhaps a beat longer than he intended. "That is not quite the same thing as wanting to now," she said. She was not unkind about it. She was just, he was beginning to understand, constitutionally precise. "No," he agreed, "it is not." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that surprised him. "My husband James used to say that a man and land are like 2 people in a long marriage," she said. "Sometimes they go cold to each other. Doesn't mean the feeling is gone. Sometimes it just needs to be restarted." She looked at the field again. "But you have to want to restart it. No one can want it for you." He looked at the dead furrows, the cracked earth, the leaning fence posts, and he thought about Clara on her knees in this same soil with her hair pinned back and her sleeves rolled up. And instead of the usual hollow ache, something else moved through him. Something small and tentative, like a bird that has landed briefly on a windowsill and might fly off at any moment but is, for now, staying. "I think I might want to restart it," he said. "I am not certain." "Certainty is overrated," she said, and walked back toward the house. He stood there for another moment, looking at the field, and then he followed her. They ate supper that evening in a stilted but not unpleasant arrangement. He had beef stew that he had made 2 days before, which he heated on the iron stove while she washed the travel dust from her face and hands at the pump outside. She sat at his table, which he had cleared of its accumulated landscape of tools and paperwork and one solitary coffee cup, and ate without fussing about the spareness of either the meal or the setting. They talked about practical things. The state of the tool shed, which she confirmed would need the roof fixed before it could be used properly. The sluice gate at the creek, the composition of the soil. Whether there was a market at Cutler's Creek for produce, which there was, she had already inquired of Reverend Fulton by correspondence. The nearest blacksmith was 7 miles east, which she noted with a calm acceptance that suggested she had lived in places with worse logistical arrangements. He told her about the land, the seasons, the particular temperament of the Cimarron Valley in drought and flood. He talked more than he had in weeks, and noticed this with a vague, distant surprise. The way you notice that you have been sitting in a room, and without realizing it the sun has shifted, and the light has changed, and it is later in the day than you thought. She listened carefully, asked questions that were informed and specific, and offered observations of her own with a matter-of-fact confidence that was not arrogance, but was very much the confidence of a person who has done the thing they are discussing and knows whereof they speak. After supper, he showed her the second room, which had been the bedroom he and Clara had shared, and which he had not entered since the first winter after her death, when he had moved his sleeping arrangement to a cot near the kitchen stove. He had aired the room that morning before she arrived, moved some boxes, and put clean linens on the bed that had come with the house when he built it, from a saddler in Caldwell who had sold him the frame for $3. Olive stood in the doorway of the room for a moment and did not ask about the life that had been lived there before. She simply said, "Thank you, Mr. Chandler," and went in and closed the door. He lay on his kitchen cot that night with the lamp turned down and listened to the quiet of the house and felt that it was, fractionally, a different quality of quiet than it had been the night before. Not empty, just still. He was not sure what to make of that. He fell asleep before he had worked it out. The next morning she was up before him, which he discovered when he rose and found a fire already going in the stove and a pot of coffee sitting at the edge of it. She was outside. He could see her through the kitchen window, walking the perimeter of the field again with a different kind of attention than the day before, carrying a stick and marking things in the dirt at intervals that seemed deliberate. He poured himself a cup of the coffee. It was strong and better than the coffee he made himself, which he had noticed over 3 years had gradually descended from acceptable to barely drinkable as he lost interest in the calibrations required to make it otherwise. He went outside. The morning was cool, the sky pale gold at the horizon, and she was crouched at the eastern end of the field with her stick marking rows in the dry crust of the earth. "Kitchen garden goes here," she said without looking up. "South-facing, good drainage off the high ground by the fence. I am thinking a 20-foot section to start. Tomatoes, beans, herbs, perhaps some turnips for autumn." She stood and shielded her eyes against the rising sun. "The main field I want to run east to west, not north to south. The slope runs east to west and water will follow it better that way. Less runoff, more absorption." "I had them running north to south," he said. "I know. I can see the old furrow lines." She looked at him. "You built this field well when you built it. I am just adjusting for what the land has shown us since." He stood with his coffee and looked at the rows she was sketching in the dirt and felt, for the first time in a long time, something that might charitably be called interest. "Tell me what you need," he said. She told him. They worked for the next 2 weeks with the focused, coordinated intensity of 2 people who have separately developed the habit of working hard and are now, unexpectedly, working together. They fixed the sluice gate, which required half a day at the North Fork with Ralph in the cold water of the creek up to his knees while Olive handed down tools, and directed from the bank with the kind of calm specificity that made the work go faster than it had any right to. They repaired the tool shed roof with lumber Ralph purchased in Cutler's Creek, driving the wagon there on a Tuesday, and loading the bed so full that Hector had a harder time of it than usual, and expressed his opinion through an afternoon of ear-laying and slow walking. They turned the field with a borrowed breaking plow from the Hargroves, who were the nearest neighbors, a mile and a half west. The Hargroves came over on the second Saturday to return a harness Ralph had lent them the previous year, and stayed 2 hours, partly out of neighborliness and partly, Ralph understood, out of frank curiosity about the woman who had arrived with a wagon full of seeds, and immediately set about resurrecting his farm. Ben Hargrove was a barrel-chested man in his 40s with a wide face and a forthright nature, and his wife Martha was sharp-eyed and warm in equal measure. They were the closest thing Ralph had had to friends in 3 years, though friendship had been a commodity he had not exactly been seeking. Martha Hargrove stood with Olive at the edge of the turned field, and talked about seeds and soil, and the particular cruelties of the territory's wind in spring. And Ralph watched Olive with the Hargroves, and noticed that she engaged with them openly but without performance, as though the version of herself she presented to new acquaintances was the same version she was all the time, and she simply did not have an alternate one available. After the Hargroves left, Ralph and Olive sat on the porch steps in the last of the afternoon light and drank water, because the coffee was gone and neither of them had yet been to the trading post in 3 days. "They are good people," Olive said. "They are," he agreed. "Ben has helped me more than I ever properly thanked him for these past years." She nodded and was quiet, and then she said, "May I ask what happened to your wife?" He had expected the question. He had been waiting for it, actually, in the way you wait for something you know is coming and cannot determine whether you dread it or need it. "Her name was Clara," he said. "She died in the spring of '79. Childbirth. The baby, too." He said it flat and steady, the way you say something you have said inside your own head 1,000 times until the words have worn smooth. "They are buried at the south end of the property, under the hackberry tree." Olive was quiet for a moment. "I am sorry," she said, just those words without elaboration or comfort, which was the right response. He had learned that empty comfort felt worse than silence, and she seemed to know this without being told. "Your husband," he said. "James. Fever," she said. 1880. We had been in Kansas 3 years. He was 34. She paused. "We did not have children. We wanted them, but they did not come." Another pause. "That is its own particular kind of grief, I have learned." "Yes," he said, though his grief had been of the other kind, the kind where something arrives and is then taken, and he could not quite compare them, but he believed her that both were real. They sat together in the companionable, slightly fragile quiet of two people who have told each other true things and are still deciding what to do with that truth. The next morning they planted the first seeds. Olive handled the seed packets with the focused tenderness of someone who has carried something a long way and knows its value. She had organized them by type and planting depth, and required spacing in the kitchen the night before, laying them out in rows across the table with a surety that had made Ralph, watching from the doorway with his evening coffee, feel something he could not immediately name. It was not until he was lying on his cot later that he identified it. He had felt, watching her, the specific warmth of witnessing a person who is entirely themselves, doing a thing they entirely love. He had not felt that particular warmth about anyone except Clara, and he lay with it in the dark for a while before sleep took him. They planted corn first, the rows running east to west as she had designed them, with Olive dropping kernels at precise intervals, while Ralph followed behind with the hand cultivator, drawing the soil over. It was a rhythm that settled into itself by the end of the first row. He stopped thinking about the mechanics of it and simply moved, and she moved, and the rows extended across the turned field in long, deliberate lines that felt, to Ralph, like sentences in a language he had forgotten and was only now beginning to remember. By the end of the second day of planting, they had the corn and the squash in the ground and a quarter of the kitchen garden done. They were both tired in the satisfying, physical way that honest work produces, and Olive made supper while Ralph saw to the horses, and they ate at the table by lamplight with the easy silence of people who have spent the day in close cooperation and have used most of their words on practical things. But gradually, over those evenings, they began to find other words too. She told him about Abilene, which she had found too loud and too fast even as a Kansas cattle town went, full of the kind of men who treated the world as though it were there primarily for their entertainment, and objected loudly when it behaved otherwise. She had lived at the edge of town on her homestead claim, which she had sold before making this journey, and had been largely self-sufficient and largely, she said without self-pity, lonely. He told her about his arrival in the territory in 1875, the years of early homesteading before Clara, the way the land had seemed like a promise when you were young enough to believe in the kind of promises land makes, and have not yet learned how casually and completely it can revoke them. He told her about building the house, taking 4 days on the framing because he had designed one wall wrong and had to disassemble it and start again, and how Clara had brought him lunch each of those 4 days and sat on an upturned crate and watched him work, and never once mentioned that he had gotten the wall wrong in the first place, a quality of grace he had not fully appreciated until later. Olive listened with her hands folded on the table and her dark eyes steady on him, and when he finished she said, "She sounds like someone who understood that a man's pride is a tool he needs to be let to keep, up to a point." Ralph looked at her. "That is," he said, "about the most accurate thing anyone has ever said about Clara in one sentence." Something shifted between them in that moment. Not dramatically. It was not the kind of shift that comes with music and weather. It was quiet and incremental, like the first faint warming of the air that you notice not because any single moment is warm enough to name, but because you realize you have stopped being cold. The first green came up 10 days after planting. Olive was the one who saw it. She was out at first light, as she always was, and Ralph heard her voice from the kitchen where he was lighting the stove. A single word, very clear in the still morning air. "Ralph." He went outside. She was standing at the edge of the corn rows with her arms at her sides and her face transformed in a way that made his chest do something complicated. The corn seedlings had broken ground in the night, those impossibly pale and determined first sprouts, standing in their long rows like the opening lines of a very promising argument. "There they are," she said softly. He stood beside her and looked at the seedlings and felt something move through him that took him a moment to identify because it had been so long since he had felt it. It was, unmistakably, hope, not the grand, shouting kind. The small, steady kind, the kind that roots itself quietly and does not require announcement but simply begins to grow. He did not say anything. She did not say anything. They stood together in the young morning light and looked at what they had grown, and the silence between them was no longer the silence of two strangers being careful with each other. It was something fuller and warmer than that. Later that day, a man came by that Ralph did not know, riding a roan horse and trailing a second animal loaded with goods. He introduced himself as Dewey Fitch, a traveling merchant working the territory circuit between Caldwell and Dodge. He was a narrow man in his 50s with a salesman's practiced ease and eyes that moved constantly, cataloging everything with the automatic inventory taking of his profession. He looked at the wagon, at the house, at the green-striped field, and then at Olive with an expression that made Ralph step, without thinking about it, slightly to the left so that he was positioned between them. "Fine place you have here," Fitch said, addressing Ralph but looking at Olive. "We are getting it there," Ralph said. "We." He had not planned that particular word. It arrived of its own accord. He felt Olive's brief stillness beside him. Fitch sold them coffee and salt and a tin of baking powder from his packs, and went on his way, and Ralph and Olive went back to their work without discussing the small thing that had happened. But it sat with Ralph through the afternoon, turning over in his mind the way a stone turns in a stream, smoothing gradually towards something. That evening after supper, while Olive was reading by the lamp, which she did most evenings from a well-traveled copy of a seed catalog she had brought from Abilene and appeared to have practically memorized, Ralph said, without looking up from the harness he was mending, "I want to ask you something." She put the catalog down and looked at him. "I told you I made no promises," he said, "and that was honest when I said it, but I have been thinking." He set the harness down and looked at her directly. "I think this is working, you and this place, you and," he paused, "me in this arrangement." He was choosing words with a care that was slightly painful to watch him exercise. "I wonder if you think the same." Olive regarded him steadily across the lamplight. "I think it is working," she said. "Yes." "I would like to not be uncertain about it," he said. "I understand that," she said. "What I mean," he said, and something in his jaw tightened for a moment, "is that I think we should make it proper. The arrangement. If that is something you want." He picked up the harness again and set it down again immediately. "I am asking badly. I apologize. I have not done this kind of asking before, at least not in this kind of circumstance." "You are asking me to marry you," she said, helping him toward the sentence he was circling. "Yes," he said, with what appeared to be profound relief at having arrived there. She was quiet for a moment. The lamp flickered in a draft from the window and settled again. "I came here because I thought it might be possible," she said. "A life that worked. With a man who seemed, from his letter and from Reverend Fulton's description, to be someone I could respect and maybe, eventually, something more than that." She paused. "I have been here 3 weeks and I already know something more than that is possible. Maybe it has already started." She looked at him with those clear, direct eyes. "I will marry you, Ralph Chandler," he exhaled slowly. "All right," he said. "Good." He picked up the harness for the 3rd time, and this time actually resumed working on it. But there was something different in the set of his shoulders, something that had been held tight, released in increment. Olive picked up her seed catalog. After a moment she said, without looking up, "You may want to speak to Reverend Fulton when we are next in town." "I will do that," he said. They rode into Cutler's Creek the following Saturday. It was a town of perhaps 300 permanent residents, growing the way territory towns grew in the early 80s, with a rawness about its streets and buildings that spoke of recent construction and optimistic expectations. There was a general store, a blacksmith, a feed merchant, a boarding house, a small newspaper office, 2 saloons, and the church where Reverend Fulton presided over the spiritual, and to a considerable extent, social operations of the valley's scattered population. Reverend Fulton was a compact, energetic man in his 50s with a gray beard, and the kind of enthusiasm for other people's happiness that stops short of intrusiveness, because it is genuinely well meant. He greeted Olive with the warm recognition of someone who has conducted a prolonged correspondence, and is pleased to find the correspondent matches the letters. He greeted Ralph with an almost visible satisfaction that he had the decency to keep mostly internal. They arranged to be married in 2 weeks, which was the earliest possible date given the need for a proper reading of the banns, which Reverend Fulton took seriously as a matter of record, even in this part of the territory where formal process was sometimes observed in the breach. After leaving the church they went to the general store for supplies, and while Ralph was at the counter negotiating a price for seed potatoes with the proprietor, a man named Asag Greer, who was constitutionally incapable of arriving at a price without first performing an extensive theatrical debate with himself, Olive walked along the shelves in the back of the store and found, on a bottom shelf, a packet of seed she had not seen in years. Hollyhock. Not a practical plant, not something that fed anyone or served any particular agricultural purpose. Just beautiful. She held the packet for a moment, then placed it on her pile of purchases. Ralph saw it at the counter when Asag Greer was tallying the cost. "Hollyhock," he said. "For alongside the house," she said. "Clara's garden was very serious and very good, and I intend to keep it serious and good. But a house should have something beautiful near it that does not need to justify itself." He looked at the seed packet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "it should." They were married on a Saturday in June of 1882 in the Cutler's Creek Church with Ben and Martha Hargrove as witnesses, and about 40 people from the valley in attendance, most of whom Ralph had spoken to perhaps twice in 3 years, and who seemed pleased, in the uncomplicated and genuine way of people who live isolated lives and are always glad for a reason to gather, to be there. Olive wore the nicest dress she had, which was a deep green wool that was perhaps somewhat heavy for a June day, but which suited her considerably, and about which Martha Hargrove said with emphatic conviction that she looked lovely, which she did. Ralph wore his best shirt, and the vest he had last worn to a funeral and had cleaned carefully the night before, and when Olive came down the aisle of the small church toward him with her dark eyes steady, and her face composed into an expression that was not exactly happy in the easy, uncomplicated sense, but was something deeper than that, something resolved and clear and forward-looking. He felt the whole surface of himself go very still, the way a lake goes still in the moment before the wind touches it. He said his vows in a clear, careful voice. She said hers with a precision that made them sound not like a recitation, but like each word was being individually selected and placed. He put the ring on her finger, a simple gold band he had purchased from a jeweler in Cutler's Creek who had it among his small stock, and she looked down at it briefly and then back up at him. And what was in her eyes at that moment was not the theatrical radiance of wedding paintings, but something quieter and more durable: certainty. The kind she said was overrated and clearly was not. After the ceremony, there was a gathering at the Hargrove place that lasted into the evening, with food that the Valley women had collectively prepared in quantities that suggested they had been looking for an occasion of this kind for some time. There was fiddle music provided by a young man named Clay Prairie who worked at the Hargroves and played with more energy than technique, but covered the deficit with enthusiasm. People danced on the flatland beside the house in the long prairie evening, and Ralph danced with Olive, which he had not done with anyone since the harvest gathering of 1878, and found that it came back to him quickly, the particular way of moving with another person that requires attention and accommodation and produces, when it works, something better than either person could produce alone. She was, it turned out, a good dancer. Economical and well-timed, with a quality of attention that made following her lead an easy and comfortable thing. He was not surprised by this. They drove home in the late evening under a sky so full of stars that it seemed excessive, even by the generous standards of the territory sky, and they were quiet most of the way in a silence that had the quality of completion, as though a sentence had been started some weeks ago and had now, finally, found its period. The field was fully green by early July. The corn was knee-high and rising, the squash sprawling with that particular assertive exuberance of well-planted squash given adequate water, the beans climbing their poles with such determination that Olive said they were, if anything, a little ambitious for the size of the support structure. The kitchen garden was producing already, and Olive took them through it each morning like a person conducting a review, noting what was flourishing and what needed adjustment with the practiced eye of someone who has been reading gardens the way others read faces, with attention and with love. Ralph found himself in the field every morning before the heat came in, and he could not have precisely said when he had stopped doing it out of commitment to the project and started doing it out of something that felt like wanting to. It had happened the way things happen in the natural world, gradually and without announcement, like the corn itself. One day you looked and it was there. He mended the rest of the fence. He replaced the tool shed door that had been hanging on one hinge since the previous winter. He repaired the sluice gate housing properly rather than the temporary fix that had held the first season. He built a second table for the kitchen because Olive required workspace that he did not have, a project that took him 2 evenings, and produced something that was not a fine piece of furniture by any ambitious measure but was solid and level and served its purpose. She noticed each of these things. She did not make a ceremony of noticing, did not offer speeches of appreciation or sentimentality, but when he finished a thing she would look at it with that precise, assessing attention she gave to everything, and then she would look at him, and there was something in that look that was warm and clear and steady. It was its own kind of language, the one they were building between them. The territory summer of 1882 was hot but not brutal, which in that particular climate meant something. There were 3 major storms in July that brought good rain and one in August that brought too much, flooding the low end of the North Field for 2 days, but the drainage held and the crop survived. By the end of August, it was clear that this was going to be a good harvest, perhaps the best this particular piece of land had produced in years. One evening in late August, after they had walked the field in the cooling air of sundown and Ralph had taken count of the corn ears within reach and pronounced himself satisfied, and they were sitting on the porch in the way they had developed, side by side with the yard spread out before them and the last light making long shadows of everything. Olive said, "I think you love this land." He considered this. "I think I had stopped," he said. "I think I am starting again." She turned her head and looked at him. The evening light was kind to her, not that she needed particular kindness, but it illuminated the lines of her face and the dark water of her eyes and the particular gravity that was the characteristic expression of her, thoughtful and direct, and with something underneath it, something warmer, that he was only now beginning to read fluently. "I think that is true of more than the land," she said. He turned and looked at her. The moment was quiet and the light was good and the field was green behind her. His field, their field, full of things they had planted together and watched grow. And Ralph Chandler, who had been a man standing at the edge of a dead thing and feeling nothing, felt everything, felt it all at once, everything that had been gathered and waiting. "Olive," he said. "Yes," she said, which was both an answer to a question he had not spoken and an opening to the one he was about to. He reached over and took her hand, which was a capable, sun-dark hand with soil still at the edges of the nails, and held it in his own larger hand, and she let him, and turned her hand so her fingers were through his. "I did not expect you," he said. "I know," she said. "I think I was expecting to stay exactly as I was for quite a considerable time longer," he said. "I know that too," she said. "I could see that when I arrived. I thought this man is intending to stay unhappy and he has made some very organized arrangements to ensure it." He laughed. It was a short sound, a little rusty from disuse, but genuine. "Is that what you thought?" "More or less," she said. "I also thought he has very good soil and is wasting it criminally, which I found almost equally provoking." "Almost equally," he said. "Almost," she said, and there was something in the word, a warmth that had finally stopped qualifying itself, that made him lean toward her, and she toward him, and he kissed her in the late August evening on the porch of his house, and she kissed him back with a simplicity and completeness that said everything the months of careful, practical, incremental growing toward each other had been building toward. The harvest in September exceeded what Ralph had dared to calculate. They loaded the wagon 4 times and drove to Cutler's Creek, where a Sag Greer at the general store bought corn, squash, and dried beans at prices that reflected, in the supply and demand arithmetic of a small territory town, how much the valley needed this kind of production. Olive had also, quietly and with considerable forethought, sent a letter in July to a distribution agent in Caldwell who dealt in bulk produce, and this man, a Mr. Delacroix, arrived in the first week of October with a wagon and a standing offer that was substantially better than Greer's retail price. Ralph had not been aware of the letter or the negotiation until Mr. Delacroix arrived. He had stood in the yard listening to Olive discuss terms with a merchant from Caldwell, in a way that demonstrated both a precise knowledge of fair market price and an absolute refusal to accept anything below it, and felt that particular combination of admiration and the slightly humbling awareness that she had been operating 3 moves ahead of him since before she arrived. After Delacroix left, with a handshake agreement that he would return next season and a price per bushel established that made Ralph do a private arithmetic in his head that produced a number somewhat larger than his entire income from the previous 2 years combined, Ralph looked at Olive and said, "You wrote to him in July." "I did," she said. "Before we were married," he said. "Yes," she said. "I was planning ahead." "You were very confident," he said. "I was confident in the land," she said, and then with a small, precise smile, "and somewhat confident in you." He pulled her to him with both arms, right there in the yard, and she made a small surprised sound and then settled against him with the same quality of complete attention she brought to everything, her hands against his chest and her face turned up to him. "You are a remarkable woman, Olive Chandler," he said. She looked at him. It was the first time he had used that name for her and they both noted it. "Yes," she said. "I am." Then, quietly, "And you are more than you think you are, Ralph Chandler." He held her for a moment in the October sun with the harvested field spread around them, empty now but not dead, resting, gathering itself for another year, the way things do when they are alive and tended and loved. That winter was a cold one. The territory winters could be severe, and 1882 going into 1883 did not disappoint on that score. There were 3 blizzards between December and February that kept them inside for days at a time, and Ralph mended every piece of equipment he owned, and some he had been meaning to replace for years, and Olive worked through the winter with a project she had been developing since autumn, a set of growing tables near the south windows, where she raised seedlings in shallow wooden trays, extending the growing season backward and forward at both ends. The house, which had been a functional and largely impersonal space for 3 years, became, over that winter, genuinely inhabited. This happened in small ways. Olive hung dried herbs from the kitchen ceiling, filling the room with a smell that was green and good in contrast to the gray cold outside. She made curtains for the windows from fabric purchased at Greer's store, nothing elaborate, just a rust-colored cotton that caught the light in a way that changed the character of a room noticeably. She arranged the kitchen according to a logic he did not initially understand, and then came to see was more efficient than his previous arrangement in 3 distinct ways. He contributed to the wintertime habitation of the house in his own ways. He built shelves in the main room for her books and seed catalogs. He fixed the draft in the chimney that had been causing the stove to smoke slightly in northerly winds and had been causing him mild irritation for 2 years. He built a proper woodbox inside the back door, so she did not have to go out to the woodpile in bad weather for every load. One evening in December, he came in from tending the horses to find her at the kitchen table, not reading or working, just sitting with her hands around a cup of coffee, looking at nothing in particular. He hung up his coat and poured himself a cup and sat across from her. "All right," he asked. She looked at him across the table. "I was thinking about James," she said. Not with guilt, just with the direct openness she brought to all things. "Sometimes he comes to me in the quiet. I do not think that stops." "No," he said, "it does not stop." They were quiet together for a moment. "I was thinking," she said, "about how strange it is that grief can be present and happiness also, that they are not opposites, that they can live in the same house." She looked at her coffee cup. "In the same person." "Yes," he said. He thought about Clara, the hackberry tree at the south end of the field, the way he sometimes still walked down there in the evenings when the light was going. "I think that is one of the things I understand about you," he said, "that you know that." She looked up at him. "You walk to the south end in the evenings," she said, not an accusation, not even an observation with weight to it, just an acknowledgement. "Yes," he said. "Good," she said. "You should." He looked at her for a moment. This woman who had ridden 4 days across the territory with a wagon full of seeds and a practical letter and a quality of self that he thought now must have required considerable courage, not the theatrical kind but the quiet kind, the kind that gets up and goes forward every day not because it has to, but because it has decided to. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "I am glad you came," he said. It was the most inadequate sentence for what he meant and also entirely true. She turned her hand over and held his. "So am I," she said. In February, on a day when the snow was thick against the windows and the wind was doing its worst, Olive told him she thought she might be pregnant. She told him in the same tone she used for most things, even informative without drama, but her eyes were different when she said it. There was something in them he had not seen before, something uncertain and very young, and he understood that of all the things she faced with composure and competence, this was one that moved her past the point where composure was entirely available. He came around the table and put his hands on her face and looked at her. "How do you feel?" he asked. "I feel," she said, and then stopped and started again. "I feel as though I have been given something I had decided I was not going to have, and I do not know yet what to do with that." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were bright with something. "We will figure out what to do with it," he said. "Together." She put her hands over his and leaned her head slightly against his palms. "Yes," she said. "We will." He held her face in his hands for another moment, and then, Because she was Olive and she would want this, he said. The seedling tables will need to be moved. You should not be carrying those trays. She made a small sound that was halfway between a laugh and an exhale of feeling. Not yet, she said. It is February. We have time. We have time, he agreed. The spring planting of 1883 began in early April, and it was a larger and more ambitious operation than the year before. Olive had expanded her seed stock over the winter, trading by letter with several other homesteaders and with a seed company in Kansas City. And the plan for the field this season included a new section along the north fence for a kitchen garden expansion, a sorghum planting for livestock feed and market, and a small orchard she had been planning since the previous autumn, 6 apple trees and 4 peach trees that she had arranged through a nursery in Caldwell, and that arrived in wooden crates in late March. Dormant and looking extremely unimpressive, but which she handled with the reverence due to long-term investments. Those will not bear for 3 years, Ralph said, looking at the scrawny-looking trees. I know, she said. 3 years is not very long. He looked at her. She was 5 months along now and beginning to show, and she worked at the same pace and with the same focus as always, making accommodations when she needed to with a practicality that was typically hers, asking for help when she needed it without making either a production of needing it or an issue of asking. No, he said, thinking of 3 years in a different context than she meant, and then arriving at the same conclusion. 3 years is not very long at all. They planted the orchard trees along the south fence, in a line running east from the hackberry tree where Clara and the baby were buried. Olive had been the one to suggest this placement. She had said simply that the south fence got good sun and the drainage was favorable, both of which were true. Ralph had understood both what she said and what she also meant, which was that this was a good place to grow something permanent and beautiful, and that the past and the present could share a fence line without either diminishing the other. He had planted the first tree himself, driving the post-hole digger into the spring earth with a deliberateness that was both agricultural and something else, something that was simultaneously a conversation with a person no longer there, and a statement about the continuing world. Olive had stood nearby and waited, understanding, and when he had set the tree in its hole and was filling in around the roots, she had come and stood beside him and helped pack the soil at the base. That was the kind of marriage it was. Ben Hargrove came to help with the field preparation in late April, as he had the year before, and this time he brought his teenage son Marcus, who was 16 and large for his age, and worked with the uncoordinated but willing energy of a person who has not yet worked out how to direct all the physical capacity they have recently acquired. Ralph gave him the straightforward tasks, and he performed them with enthusiasm, and Ralph found himself, watching the boy, thinking about things he had not permitted himself to think about for 3 years. In the evenings during planting week, the Hargroves stayed for supper, and the table that had sat in Ralph's kitchen silent and largely unused for years was loud and full of talk, the specific kind of talk that happens when people are tired from good physical work and are fed and warm and are glad of each other's company. Martha Hargrove and Olive talked about babies, specifically about the baby that was coming, with a frank practicality that Ralph found somewhat alarming in its medical specificity, and which Olive engaged with the direct engagement she brought to all practical subjects. She will need someone there, Martha told Ralph, with the directness of a woman who has had children and knows the requirement. When the time comes, I will come, or one of the women from town. Olive, he said, do you want? Yes, Olive said before he finished the sentence. Martha has agreed. She looked at him steadily. I am not afraid, Ralph. I know you are not, he said. That is not what I am worried about. She understood what he was worried about. Clara. He did not say it, and she did not say it, and they looked at each other across the table in the middle of the Hargroves' suppertime conversation, and everything was said without words, the way things are between two people who have learned to read each other. I know, she said quietly. All right, he said. The summer of 1883 unfolded in the way of summers that are both productive and quietly momentous. The crop came in strong again, stronger than the year before, because the soil was better managed now, and the irrigation system was running at full efficiency, and Olive's knowledge of companion planting and soil amendment had been applied with a systematic attention that showed in the results. The sorghum was a new success, producing well and selling well to the feed merchant in Cutler's Creek who had not had a local source in years. The apple and peach trees leafed out along the south fence and were, after their dormant winter appearance, unexpectedly hopeful. Ralph had found himself, somewhere in the course of that spring and summer, becoming a different kind of man than the one who had stood at the edge of a dead field 2 years ago. Not an entirely different man. He was still quiet by nature and somewhat solitary by habit, and inclined toward practicality over sentiment in most things. But where there had been, in the man of 2 years ago, a quality of suspension, of a life being held motionless by grief, there was now a quality of motion. Forward, ordinary, working-day motion, the motion of a man who has things to tend and reasons to tend them and people to come home to at the end of the day. He had not planted anything in 3 years, and now he planted everything. In July, when the corn was tall and the evenings were long and warm, he and Olive took to walking the field after supper the way they had taken to the porch in the early months, side by side in the rows with the corn higher than both their heads and the sky dimming through orange to purple above the stalks, talking about the day, the crop, small things, large things, nothing things that are the substance of a shared life. On one of these evenings, walking the long east-west rows, Ralph stopped in the middle of the field and turned to look at her. The last light was good and the corn was all around them, and she stood there, 8 months along and magnificent in the way that women of strong character and physical capability are magnificent, with everything about her that was Olive entirely present and undiminished. The directness of her gaze, the economy of her movements, the quality of settled sureness that she carried the way another woman might carry jewelry. "I need to tell you something," he said. She looked at him and waited. "I need to tell you," he said, "that I am in love with you. I know that may seem like something that should have been said before this, and perhaps it was implied, but I want to say it directly because you are a person who deserves direct things." He paused. "I am completely in love with you, Olive. I did not expect to be. I think I needed you to show up with seeds before I could be again." She looked at him for a long moment, standing in the corn in the last light. Then she stepped forward and put both her hands on his face, carefully because her balance was different now, and looked at him with those dark river-water eyes that were undefended and full. "I love you, Ralph Chandler," she said. "I loved you before I was sure I was going to, which was inconvenient for my plans." The small, precise smile touched her mouth. "I will love you for a very long time." He put his arms around her carefully, accounting for the changed geometry of her body, and she leaned into him with a completeness that was not like leaning on a support but like two things completing a shape, and they stood in the tall corn as the last light went out of the sky and the first stars came on, and Ralph held his wife and felt the present moment like a full cup. The baby came in late August. It was a hard labor, long and demanding, and Martha Hargrove was there, and a woman named Edith Cross from Cutler's Creek who had midwife experience and was worth everything she asked for her services. Ralph was in the main room for most of it, which he was, frankly, not equal to in the way he had hoped he would be. He paced and did not pace and went outside and came back in and was told firmly by Martha at one point to sit down and stay still, and did so for approximately 11 minutes before not being still again. He thought of Clara. He thought of the morning he had understood that both of them were gone before he had reached the house from the north field. He sat in his chair in the main room with his hands folded and prayed, which was not something he did often or with any practiced eloquence, just a direct and honest request to whoever was listening that she be all right. He heard the baby cry. It was a loud, indignant cry, the the cry of someone who has unexpectedly arrived somewhere and has opinions about the arrangement. Ralph was on his feet before the sound finished. Martha opened the bedroom door, and her face was tired and completely pleased. "She is well," Martha said. "Both of them come in." He went in. Olive was propped against the pillows, flushed and worn and entirely present, and she was holding a small, extremely new person who was still expressing grievances at significant volume. She looked up at Ralph with eyes that were full of everything and steady at the same time. "Come meet your son," she said. Ralph stood at the bedside and looked at the small, furious person in Olive's arms. His son. The word arrived with a weight that was both enormous and somehow exactly what his chest had been built to hold. He sat on the edge of the bed carefully, and Olive placed the baby in his arms with the calm authority of a person who has just done the hardest thing she has ever done and is not going to be precious about the outcome. The baby, his son, was red-faced and wrinkled and entirely unlike anything Ralph had encountered before, despite theoretically having encountered human beings throughout his life, and was looking up at him now with an expression of profound and recent displeasure that Ralph suspected was the face of someone who had arrived expecting a particular arrangement and had not found it. "Hello," Ralph said, which was, again, not the most illuminating thing he had ever said, but the baby seemed to accept it. He sat there holding his son and looked at Olive. "Thomas," she said. "I think Thomas." He looked at the baby. "Thomas," he said. The baby's expression moderated slightly from displeasure to something more like cautious inquiry. "Thomas," Olive confirmed. "Thomas Chandler," Ralph said. "Yes," she said. "That." He looked at her over their son's head and felt the full weight of the present, the corn in the field, the trees along the south fence, the repaired fences and the proper roof, and the seeds she had brought from Abilene in a wooden box packed with straw, the seeds they had planted together in the cracked earth of a field that had not been planted in 3 years, and all the things that had grown from that beginning that were not corn at all. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Thank you," she said back. The autumn harvest of 1883 was the best the Chandler farm had produced. They filled the root cellar to capacity, sold to Delacroix's agent in Caldwell and to Greer's store, and to 2 other homesteads in the valley that were short of feed grain, and cleared more money in that single season than Ralph had made in the 3 years previous combined. He paid the last of a debt he had owed to a Caldwell bank since 1879. A formality that cost him a trip to town, and produced a satisfaction so complete that he sat in the wagon on the way home and smiled to himself for about 4 miles. Thomas Chandler, who had arrived with opinions and had not subsequently abandoned them, was by October a person of considerable presence and developing personality, requiring things loudly and often, and responding with a full-body enthusiasm to the people he recognized as his people. Ralph held him in the mornings while Olive did the first check of the seedling tables, and was struck repeatedly by the specific astonishment of being responsible for a person this small and this certain of himself. He was, Ralph thought privately, already a little like Olive. He told her this one morning, and she considered it seriously and said, "Good. He will have better instincts for the soil than you." Ralph, who knew that this was probably true, accepted it. Winter settled over the Cimarron Valley again, and the farm settled with it into the rhythm of the cold season. Ralph reinforced the barn against the anticipated cold with the same attention he now brought to all the maintenance of the property. The tool shed, the irrigation system, the fences, the house itself. These were things that worked because they were attended to, and attending to them was no longer a minimum requirement that he satisfied out of obligation. It was simply what he did, what they did. Olive continued the seedling tables and spent the winter evenings expanding her record-keeping, something she had begun in the first summer, a ledger in which she tracked planting dates, soil conditions, yields, and observations about what had worked and what had not. By the second winter, it was a document of considerable agricultural value, and she wrote in it with the same precision she brought to the field, building a body of knowledge about this particular piece of land that would be useful not just this year, but in the years to come. Ralph read portions of it sometimes in the evenings, and it moved him in a way he found slightly surprising, not because it was particularly emotional in its language. It was not. It was extremely practical, but because it was evidence of a mind that had committed itself entirely and permanently to this place, this soil, this future. A mind that was planning orchards and crop rotations and soil improvements for years out, building something in the long sense. She had come with seeds and she was still planting, in every sense of the word. In the spring of 1884, when Thomas was 7 months old and developing a strong personal relationship with Hector the Bay gelding, who tolerated the baby's enthusiastic attention with a patience that suggested either good character or advanced age, Ralph and Olive had a conversation about the land itself that would determine the shape of the next decade. Ben Hargrove mentioned, at the beginning of April, that the homestead to the east of Ralph's property, a quarter section that had been worked inadequately by a family named Prout, and abandoned the previous autumn when the husband had decided the territory was not for him, was available for filing. 160 acres of bottomland adjacent to the North Fork. Ralph and Olive sat at the kitchen table that evening with the lamp and the ledger, and calculated what it would require and what it could produce, and whether the capital they had was sufficient, and whether the labor was manageable, and what it would mean for the operation over the next 5 years. It took them 3 evenings to reach a conclusion, because they were both thorough and because Olive had more questions about soil quality and water access and Ralph had more questions about fence lines and existing structures. And they went through all of it with the systematic attention they brought to every shared decision. At the end of the 3rd evening, Olive said, "File the claim." Ralph filed the claim in the 2nd week of April. The expanded operation required more hands than 2 people could provide and still manage Thomas and the household and maintain the quality of attention the land required. Ralph hired a young man from Cutler's Creek named Franklin Ames, 19 years old, the son of a family that had been in the valley for 3 years and had produced a diligent and reliable young person who knew which end of a horse to approach and was willing to learn the rest. Franklin lived in a small room built against the east side of the barn that Ralph and Ben Hargrove constructed together in 3 days in May, a compact and functional space with a stove connection and a window facing east. Olive paid Franklin fairly and on schedule, a practice she regarded as completely non-negotiable, and treated him with the matter-of-fact respect she extended to anyone doing competent work, which was the kind of treatment that produced loyalty more reliably than any speech about loyalty could. The summer of 1884 was the year Ralph's farm became something people in the valley talked about. Not because of any single dramatic event, but because of the quiet, compounding evidence of sustained, competent operation. The orchards leafing strongly in their 2nd year, the corn yield that was the highest per acre in the valley, the kitchen garden visible from the south road when you passed, which people did, sometimes with specific intent to see it. A garden that had started with seeds brought in a wooden box from Abilene and had become, in 2 seasons of Olive's attention, something that Clara herself would have stood at the fence of and admired. The hollyhocks had come in along the house. Tall, impractical, and entirely beautiful in shades of pink and deep red, they flanked the front door and climbed the porch post and justified themselves entirely and without apology. Ralph was working the north fence line one afternoon in September, checking the posts after a heavy August rain, when he stopped at the northeast corner and looked back at the house. The field ran from where he stood to the house in long, managed rows. The garden was visible in its organized abundance near the south wall. The apple and peach trees were small but upright along the south fence, bearing their first modest fruit. Smoke came from the kitchen chimney where Olive was probably, At this time of afternoon, doing some combination of cooking and watching Thomas, who was now crawling at a speed that represented an ongoing logistical challenge. Franklin Ames was visible at the far end of the field, turning the last section of the new ground. Ralph stood at the fence post and looked at all of it, and tried to remember clearly the man who had stood at the edge of a dead field in the spring of 1882 and felt nothing. He could remember the facts of it. The feeling was harder to locate. It was not that it was gone exactly. Grief did not go. But it had been joined by so many other things, things that had been planted by deliberate hands and had grown in the turned and tended earth of a life returned to the business of living, that it no longer occupied the whole field. He finished the fence check and walked back to the house. Olive was at the table with Thomas on a blanket on the floor beside her, the ledger open, when he came in. Thomas was engaged in a focused investigation of a wooden spoon that had been given to him as a distraction from the table leg he had been using to pull himself upward, and he looked up at Ralph's entrance with the large, immediate recognition of someone who has been waiting for a specific person and is entirely pleased at the arrival. "Duh," said Thomas, who had recently arrived at this syllable and was deploying it with great frequency and considerable satisfaction. "That's right," Ralph said and picked him up. Olive looked at the two of them with an expression that was not her practical face or her assessing face but the third one, the one that was entirely for them, warm and full and unguarded. "The north fence?" she asked. "Good," he said. "2 posts need to be set deeper in the spring when the ground is soft again, otherwise sound." He sat down with Thomas in his lap. "How is the yield calculation?" "Good," she said. "Better than last year. The new ground is productive." She made a note in the ledger. "Franklin did well with it." "He is a good worker," Ralph said. "He is," she agreed. "We should give him a larger role next season. He is ready for more responsibility." Thomas grabbed Ralph's shirt collar and examined it with the scientific interest he brought to most objects. "Agreed," Ralph said. This was a Tuesday in September, nothing particular about it. An ordinary evening in an ordinary week in a life that had been rebuilt from its foundations by 2 people with practical skills and the willingness to invest them in something, and in each other, and it was entirely, unreservedly good. The harvest of 1884 exceeded the previous year. They expanded the delivery arrangement with Delacroix's Caldwell agent to include a regular monthly supply of dried goods through the winter, which required Olive to develop a storage and packaging system over the autumn that occupied 2 weeks of detailed planning and execution, and produced a root cellar and barn storage arrangement of such efficiency that Franklin Ames spent a day looking at it in unconcealed admiration, and copied the organizational principle for his personal tool storage, which Ralph found when he discovered this to be extremely funny. The Chandler farm became, in the valley's informal economy, something of a reliable quantity. People came to buy seed corn saved from Olive's carefully selected stock. A homesteader from 12 miles north named Cassidy came twice in the autumn to consult with Olive about soil amendment for his clay-heavy land, and she gave him 2 hours of her time and a list of recommendations that she wrote out in her precise hand, and that he was apparently still carrying in his vest pocket when he came back the following spring to report results with an enthusiasm that verged on the religious. Martha Hargrove told Ralph one Saturday in November, with the frank warmth of someone delivering news they know will be well received, that people in the valley talked about his wife with the kind of respect usually reserved for people who have been in a place much longer than 2 years. "She has earned it," Ralph said simply. "She has," Martha agreed. "And so have you." He thought about that on the way home. The thing about earning something he had learned was that you did not always notice you were earning it. You noticed the individual things, the fence post, the seed, the furrow, the morning in the field. You did not always see the accumulation until you stood back from it. He had been standing back from it more lately, from the life, from the farm, from the man he was becoming, and finding the view to be one that did not embarrass him. Olive was nursing Thomas in the rocking chair by the stove when he came in, the lamp making a warm circle in the December evening. She looked up at him and smiled, the full one she had taken its time arriving, but once it had arrived came easily and entirely. "Good trip?" she asked. "Good," he said. He hung up his coat and hat and poured himself coffee from the pot and came to sit in the other chair, and Thomas, disturbed from his dinner by this arrival, turned his head and regarded Ralph with the round, serious gaze of someone who has been interrupted and is reserving judgment. "Hargrove says people talk well of you," Ralph said. "I heard the same about you," she said, returning to Thomas. "We are becoming," he said, "people who belong here." She looked up at him again. "We were always going to belong here," she said. "You belonged here first. You just needed a reason to remember it." He looked at her in the lamplight, his wife, the woman who had come 4 days across the territory with a wagon full of seeds and a letter written in a careful, unhurried hand, and the particular quality of self that had reached into the dead field of him and found, under the cracked surface, the still living soil. "You were the reason," he said. She looked at him steadily, Thomas settling again in her arms. "And you were mine," she said. The years that followed were the years of growth and accumulation, and the quiet compound interest of a well-lived life. The orchard bore its first real fruit in the autumn of 1885, and Olive made apple butter and peach preserves in quantities that supplied the Chandler household, the Hargroves, Franklin Ames family in town, and generated a small but reliable trade income. Ralph built a proper fruit cellar that winter, dug into the south slope of the yard, stone-lined and properly ventilated, the kind of structure built for decades. Thomas, who walked at 13 months and talked enthusiastically at 18, and was, by his second birthday, a person with clear opinions on all subjects including the proper management of the chickens Olive had acquired in the spring of 1884, grew into a child of evident capability, and the same direct, considering quality that characterized his mother, mixed with a stubbornness about physical challenge that Ralph recognized as entirely paternal. He followed Ralph in the field with a seriousness that the farm operation might have found slightly undermined by his inability to reach the top of the fence rails, and followed Olive in the kitchen garden with an attention that was equally serious and considerably more useful given his height, which was adequate to most low planting tasks by age 3. A daughter came in the spring of 1886. They named her Clara. Ralph had not suggested the name. Olive had, one evening in the 3rd month of the pregnancy, sitting at the table with her ledger. She had said it simply and directly. "If it is a girl, I would like to name her Clara." She had looked at him. "If that is something you can be comfortable with." He had been very still for a moment. Then he said, "I think that is the right name." She nodded, made a note in the ledger about the seed rotation, and they moved on. That was the kind of people they were. Clara Chandler arrived in the spring with the same robust and opinionated quality that had characterized her brother, and was, from the beginning, a different kind of person. Where Thomas engaged the world with systematic attention and testing, Clara engaged it with immediate and enthusiastic response, interested in everything, deterred by nothing, vocal about all of it. Martha Hargrove, who came for the birth as she had for Thomas, declared her excellent and said so with the authority of someone who had seen many babies and knew the good ones immediately. Ralph held Clara the evening of her birth with Thomas on his knee, Thomas having been collected from the Hargroves where he had spent the day and restored to his proper position as most important person in the household, and sat in the lamplight with his family, and felt the full, completed, overflowing weight of a life that had been rebuilt not once, but continuously, every day, in the small and large decisions of 2 people who had chosen each other and kept choosing. The farm, the field, the orchard, the kitchen garden, the root cellar, the repaired fences and the proper roof and the hollyhocks alongside the door, all of it stood as evidence of what happens when you plant something in ground that is ready for it and tend it honestly and do not stop. Thomas was asleep against Ralph's arm by the time Olive was ready for Ralph to bring Clara back. He carried his daughter across the room to her mother and placed her in Olive's arms with the careful, certain hands of a man who has done this before and knows how to do it. Olive looked at Clara and then up at Ralph. "She has your jaw," Olive said. "She has your eyes," he said. Olive looked at the baby again. "Good," she said softly. "Those will serve her better." He sat on the edge of the bed with Thomas still asleep against him and leaned and kissed Olive's temple, and she turned her face slightly toward him, and they were still for a moment in the way that the best moments in a life are still, not suspended or frozen but complete, everything present and in its right place. Outside, the apple trees were in bloom along the south fence. The corn would go in next week. The field that had been dead for 3 years was resting now in the productive rest of good tended earth, gathered and ready to receive what would be asked of it, ready to grow. Ralph Chandler had not planted anything in 3 years. Then a woman had shown up with seeds, and he had found himself digging. And what had grown from that beginning was not just a field but a life, full and green and forward-looking, extending toward the horizon in long, deliberate rows that caught the morning light and held it. He would plant it again tomorrow, and the day after, and all the days after that, because the earth was good, and his hands were willing, and he had, beside him, a person who understood that the best things are grown slowly in well-tended ground. And on a May morning in 1887, 5 years after Olive Talmadge had driven her wagon up the south road with a wooden box of seeds on the seat beside her, Ralph Chandler stood at the edge of the field with his wife and his son and his daughter and looked at what they had made together. The rows of young corn in the morning sun, the apple trees in white bloom, the kitchen garden already busy with green, and he felt the specific, uncomplicated, absolutely genuine happiness of a man who has been given back his life and has known what to do with it. Olive stood beside him with Clara on her hip and her free hand in his, and Thomas was already in the field, 4 years old and involved in an investigation of the first corn seedlings that was proceeding with great scientific seriousness. "Thomas," Olive called, "do not pull them up." "I am not pulling," Thomas said, with the dignity of someone who is not pulling but who was very recently considering it. Ralph squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. The morning light came long and golden across the Cimarron Valley, the way it did in the good springs, when the rain had been enough and the soil was ready and everything that had been planted was beginning to show itself to the world. The hackberry tree at the south fence cast its familiar shadow. The hollyhocks were in their second-year growth, tall and unhurried and beautiful. The orchards promised their fruit. Ralph Chandler looked at all of it and breathed it in and was content and was grateful and was home.